Some people leave your life quietly. Others leave behind echoes, words, wounds, and doubts that follow you long after the door has closed. Grace Cole stood in front of the mirror longer than she needed to. Not because she was unsure of how she looked, but because mirrors had once been weapons in a house where love slowly turned into control. The woman staring back at her now was not the same woman who used to apologize for taking up space. Her face was calmer, her eyes steadier, her shoulders no longer curved inward like she was bracing for impact. She exhaled. 3 years. 3 years since she signed the divorce papers with a pen that shook in her hand while Ethan Cole checked his watch like he was late for something more important than her heartbreak. 3 years since she walked out of a marriage where her dreams were dismissed as hobbies, and her voice softened itself into silence to keep the peace. And now, after all that healing, there it was. The invitation. A simple text message that arrived 2 days ago, glowing on her phone like a challenge. Dinner tonight. Thought it'd be nice to clear the air. Lucy will be there too. No apology. No explanation. Just enough politeness to sound harmless, and just enough familiarity to stir memories she had worked hard to bury. Grace hadn't responded right away. She should have deleted it. She almost did. But curiosity has a way of disguising itself as courage. The restaurant loomed ahead of her now, glass walls glowing amber against the evening sky. Valets moved with rehearsed grace, and the sound of muted laughter floated out every time the door opened. This was not a place meant for discomfort. This was a place where power ate slowly and humiliation was served with wine. Grace adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder. She hadn't chosen anything extravagant to wear. No need to announce herself. A soft cream dress, modest but elegant, hugging her in a way that suggested confidence rather than desperation. Her natural hair framed her face unapologetically, no straightening, no shrinking. She walked in. The temperature inside was warm, but the air shifted the moment eyes began to slide toward her. Not in recognition, but curiosity. The kind that measures, assesses, and quietly ranks. At the center table sat Ethan. He looked comfortable. The kind of comfortable that comes from believing the world still bends in your direction. His suit was tailored, his watch expensive, his smile practiced. Beside him sat Lucy, young, luminous, draped in silk and confidence she hadn't yet earned. Lucy leaned in close to him, whispering something. Her laughter followed. Grace didn't need to hear the words. She felt them anyway. Ethan glanced up. Their eyes met. For a second, just one, something flickered across his face. Surprise. Not because she showed up, but because she didn't look the way he expected her to. No sadness. No hesitation. No visible cracks. Just grace. He recovered quickly, raising his glass slightly in acknowledgement, as if greeting an old acquaintance rather than the woman who once held his last name like a promise. Grace walked toward the table, heels clicking softly against marble floors. Each step carried the weight of memory. The nights she waited up for him, the arguments where she begged to be heard, the mornings she woke up shrinking herself to fit his expectations. She stopped at the chair across from him. Lucy looked her up and down without even pretending to hide it. "Oh," Lucy said lightly. "You actually came." Grace met her gaze, unbothered. "Yes." Ethan pulled out the chair, gesturing for Grace to sit, the performance of civility intact. "Grace," he said, "you look well. Not beautiful, not radiant, just well." As if she were a former investment whose returns he no longer tracked. Grace sat. "Thank you," she replied evenly. "So do you." Lucy smiled too widely. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "Ethan says you're very strong." The pause before strong was deliberate. Grace smiled back. "I had to be." The waiter arrived, breaking the tension, offering menus and water with professional cheer. Grace accepted hers, hands steady. Inside, though, something stirred, not fear, not insecurity, but awareness. She realized then what this dinner truly was. Not closure, not peace. This was a stage. And she had been invited not to speak, but to be seen. Grace folded her napkin onto her lap, lifting her eyes slowly to meet Ethan's once more.
He didn't know it yet.
But this would be the last time he ever sat across from her feeling superior. And somewhere beyond the warm lights and polished glass of the restaurant, Destiny was already on its way, wearing a tailored suit, carrying a quiet power and walking straight toward the woman they were about to underestimate. Grace had barely unfolded her menu when the first laugh landed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel enough to be obvious. It was the kind of laugh meant to sound effortless, polite even, but carried just enough edge to remind her that she was not seated among friends. Lucy leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with calculated elegance. "So," she said, swirling her wine as if they were old girlfriends catching up, "Ethan tells me you were always creative." Grace glanced up slowly. "Yes." "That's nice," Lucy continued. "I admire people who chase passions instead of stability." Ethan chuckled into his glass. Lucy's eyes flicked to him, pleased. Grace closed her menu gently and placed it on the table. She could feel it now, the familiar tightening in her chest. Not panic. Recognition. This was the old script. The one where she was expected to explain herself, justify her choices, soften the room with humility. She chose silence instead. Ethan noticed. He always did. "So," he said, leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table like he was about to offer friendly advice. "Are you still doing that art thing?" Grace lifted her gaze. "It's a business." Lucy blinked. "Oh, full-time?" "Yes." There was a beat. Then laughter again, this time less restrained. "I just mean," Lucy said quickly, waving her hand, "it's impressive you can survive on that. With the economy and all." Ethan nodded, smiling. Grace was never motivated by money, he added. She always believed things would work themselves out. Grace's jaw tightened, just barely. He said it like a fond memory. She remembered it as dismissal. She remembered pitching ideas at the kitchen table while he scrolled on his phone. She remembered the way he'd sigh when bills arrived, as if her dreams were the problem rather than his impatience. The waiter returned to take their orders. Lucy ordered without looking at the prices. Ethan followed. Grace ordered last.
Simple.
Thoughtful. Enough. When the waiter walked away, Lucy leaned in closer, lowering her voice, not to hide it from Grace, but to draw her in. "You know," Lucy said, "I used to be nervous meeting you. I mean, ex-wives can be complicated." Ethan smiled indulgently. "But you're very composed," Lucy continued. "I like that." Grace met her gaze. "Thank you." Lucy hesitated. She hadn't expected that tone, no bitterness, no edge. Just calm. She recovered quickly. "I suppose time does that. Teaches you how to accept where you end up."
Grace felt it then.
Not anger.
Grief.
The grief of realizing that the people who once knew her most intimately had rewritten her story, without her consent, and were now reading it back to her like fact. Ethan took a sip of wine. "So," he said casually, "where are you living these days?" "Not far." Lucy raised a brow. "Still in the city? Rent must be challenging." Grace inhaled slowly through her nose. "I manage." Ethan smiled. He always smiled when he thought he was winning. "That's good," he said. "You always did pride yourself on independence." The words slid across the table like a quiet accusation. "You needed me. You left. Now look at you." Grace straightened in her chair. "I do," she said. "Still do." Lucy tilted her head, studying her like a curiosity she couldn't quite place. "Ethan and I are getting married next spring," she said suddenly. Grace felt the words, but they didn't pierce her the way Lucy hoped. "Congratulations," Grace said. Lucy blinked again. Ethan frowned slightly. No reaction. No falter. Lucy pressed on. "We're thinking Italy. Very intimate. Very elevated." Ethan nodded. Something simple, but tasteful. Grace smiled softly. "That sounds lovely." The food arrived. Plates were placed down with delicate precision. For a moment, conversation paused. Then it happened. The waiter reached across the table to set down Lucy's dish, and his elbow knocked Grace's water glass. It tipped. Water spilled across the tablecloth, sliding dangerously close to Grace's lap. "Oh!" Lucy exclaimed, standing abruptly. "Be careful." The waiter apologized profusely.
I'm so sorry, ma'am.
"I didn't see." "It's fine," Grace said calmly, reaching for her napkin. Lucy laughed lightly, though her eyes gleamed. "Oh dear," she said. "I hope that dress isn't ruined. It looks delicate." Ethan chuckled. Grace dabbed at the fabric, unbothered. "It'll dry." Lucy watched her closely, waiting for embarrassment, for fluster, for something to justify the moment. But Grace simply sat back, composed, her dignity intact. The laughter around them, soft, amused, felt louder than it was. Grace glanced at her phone beneath the table. A single notification blinked on the screen. She checked the time. 7 minutes late. She looked back up, meeting Ethan's eyes once more. He saw it then, the absence of desperation, the lack of defense, the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove at this table. And for the first time that evening, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. Grace folded her napkin carefully. Somewhere beyond the restaurant doors, a presence was approaching, one that would shift the balance of the room without raising its voice. Grace didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited, because she knew something they didn't. The night had not yet reached its turning point. The first thing Grace noticed was the silence. It crept in quietly, stealing the laughter from nearby tables and smoothing the edges of conversation until the restaurant seemed to inhale all at once. Forks paused midair. Wineglasses hovered just above linen. Someone, had altered the rhythm of the room. Grace didn't turn right away.
She didn't need to.
She felt it. The doors at the front of the restaurant opened with a soft, controlled ease, letting in a rush of cool night air and the low murmur of recognition. Heads turned, not in curiosity, but in reverence. The kind of reaction reserved for people who didn't announce themselves because they never had to. A man stepped inside.
Tall.
Immaculate. Wrapped in a black tailored suit that looked custom-made rather than expensive, because men like him didn't ask about price. They asked about control. His presence wasn't loud. There was no swagger, no performative charm. Just certainty. The kind that settled into a room and rearranged it around him. Whispers followed in his wake. "Is that? No, it can't be. That's Kong Junseo." Grace closed her eyes for half a second. Relief washed through her, quiet and grounding. Right on time. Ethan frowned, following the trail of attention. "Who is that?" he muttered, annoyance threading his voice. He didn't like not being the most important man in the room. Lucy leaned forward, eyes wide, her polished smile faltering as she took in the scene. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ethan, I think that's him." "Him who?" "The Korean billionaire. The CEO everyone's been talking about. He's on magazine covers. I saw him at a gala once from across the room." Ethan scoffed, though his posture stiffened. What would someone like that be doing here? The answer was already walking toward their table. Junseo moved through the restaurant with measured steps, acknowledging the manager with a slight nod, returning a polite greeting from a nearby investor, ignoring the stares without appearing dismissive. His eyes scanned the room once, sharp, observant. Before softening the moment they found Grace. Everything in him changed then. The tension in his shoulders eased. His stride slowed, not from hesitation, but intention. Grace finally turned. Their eyes met. A smile curved her lips, not wide, not dramatic, but real. The kind that came from being seen, understood, and protected without having to ask. Ethan noticed it. The smile unsettled him. Junseo stopped beside the table, his presence casting a quiet shadow over the space. "Grace."
His voice was calm, deep.
"Familiar." "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, eyes warm. The meeting ran longer than expected. Grace rose to her feet. "It's all right," she replied softly. "I figured." He took her hand, not to show ownership, but connection, and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Lucy gasped before she could stop herself. Ethan stared. "Excuse me," Ethan said sharply. Can we help you? Juncio turned toward him slowly. For a moment, the silence stretched. Then, I'm Juncio, he said. Grace's husband. The word landed. Husband. Not partner. Not friend. Not date. Husband. Grace's fingers tightened slightly around his. Ethan blinked.
Once. Twice.
He laughed, abrupt and hollow. That's not funny. Grace met his gaze calmly. I wasn't joking. Lucy's face drained of color. You're married, she whispered. Grace nodded. 2 years. Lucy looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Grace. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Juncio pulled out the chair beside Grace and waited until she sat before taking his own seat. The gesture was quiet, natural, as if the world worked this way because it always had. He glanced at the half-finished plates. I hope I didn't interrupt anything important. No, Grace said smoothly. Just catching up. Lucy forced a laugh. Well, this is unexpected. Juncio regarded her politely. Life often is. The manager appeared almost immediately, voice trembling slightly. Mr. Kong, your table is ready whenever you are. Thank you, Juncio replied. We'll join you shortly. The manager nodded and retreated. Ethan leaned forward, disbelief bleeding into his tone. You're telling me you married him? Yes, Grace said. When? After the divorce.
How?
Grace smiled faintly. I met someone who valued me. Silence. Lucy swallowed hard. I had no idea, she said. Ethan never mentioned. Why would he? Grace asked gently. It wasn't his story to tell. Juncio placed his hand over Grace's on the table, thumb brushing lightly against her skin. His touch grounded her. Ethan felt something twist in his chest. This was not the woman he remembered. And this man was not someone he could dismiss. Grace lifted her gaze, calm and luminous. The humiliation they had planned was unraveling before their eyes. And this was only the beginning. The silence after Juncio's words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened, pressing down on the table until even breathing seemed deliberate. Grace could hear the faint clink of cutlery from distant tables, the low hum of conversation restarting around them, but here, at this table, time stalled. Ethan stared at Juncio as if waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. Instead, Juncio sat with effortless composure, one hand resting over Grace's, his posture relaxed, his presence unmovable. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to assert himself. Men like him never did. Lucy was the first to break the silence. You're married, she said again, this time slower, like repeating the words might change their meaning. Grace nodded. Yes. Lucy's gaze dropped to Grace's hand, now clearly adorned with a slim, elegant ring she had never noticed before. How long? 2 years, Grace replied. Ethan's laugh burst out suddenly, sharp and disbelieving. 2 years, he echoed. You expect me to believe you married a billionaire CEO 2 years ago and never thought to mention it? Grace turned to him fully, then. Her eyes were steady.
Clear.
I didn't owe you an update on my happiness. The words landed cleanly. No malice, no bitterness, just truth. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then leaned back in his chair as if physical distance might help him regain balance. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I mean, come on. This feels staged. Lucy nodded too quickly, eager for something, anything, to cling to. Right, she said. People do that sometimes. Hire someone to make a point. Grace felt Juncio's fingers tighten slightly over hers, not in anger, but restraint. He turned to Lucy with a calm that bordered on surgical. You believe my wife would need to hire anyone to validate her worth? Lucy swallowed. I didn't mean... Juncio smiled politely. I know exactly what you meant. The temperature at the table dropped. Ethan scoffed again, but there was uncertainty now, leaking through his bravado. If this is real, he said, then why didn't anyone know? Grace tilted her head. Did you ask? The question stunned him. You left, she continued. You moved on quickly. You replaced me before the ink on the divorce papers dried. Why would my life be visible to you? Her voice never wavered, but the truth cut deeply. Ethan remembered it then. How he had introduced Lucy to friends barely months after the separation, how he had dismissed Grace's pain as emotional exaggeration, how he had assumed she would fade quietly into the background. This was not fading. This was evolution. Lucy shifted uncomfortably. I just think it's strange, she said, her voice brittle. You never seemed interested in men like that. Grace smiled softly. I wasn't interested in power, she replied. I was interested in partnership. Juncio turned to Grace then, admiration unguarded in his eyes. You told me once, he said, that you wanted someone who didn't ask you to shrink. She met his gaze. And you listened. Ethan looked between them, something ugly curling in his chest. You used to need me, he said suddenly. You depended on me. Grace nodded slowly. I thought I did, she said. That's what you taught me. The words hung there. Lucy's fingers trembled as she reached for her glass. This is a lot, she muttered. Ethan, say something. But Ethan was quiet now. For the first time, he was not steering the conversation, not controlling the narrative. Juncio spoke again. Grace didn't come here to make a statement, he said. She came because she was invited. He glanced briefly at Ethan. An invitation should be given with respect. Ethan's jaw tightened. So what, you're here to what? Show me up. Juncio considered him calmly.
No. He paused.
I'm here to pick up my wife. Grace exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding all evening. The waiter approached nervously. Mr. Kong, your private dining room is prepared. Private. Lucy's eyes widened. Ethan stiffened. You own this place? Ethan asked, incredulous. Juncio shook his head slightly. My company does, he replied. We acquired the restaurant group last year. Lucy let out a faint, breathless laugh. That's impressive. Yes, Juncio said. It is. Grace stood. She smoothed her dress, calm and unhurried. Thank you for dinner, she said to Ethan. Truly. He looked up at her, searching her face for something, regret, longing, doubt. There was none. I hope, she added gently, that one day you learn the difference between being needed and being chosen. Lucy's lips parted, but no words came. Grace turned away. Juncio offered his arm. She took it. As they walked toward the private dining room, the weight of the table they left behind grew heavier with every step. The laughter, the superiority, the assumptions, they all collapsed into an unbearable quiet. Ethan sat frozen. Lucy stared at the tablecloth. And Grace walked forward, not because she had won, but because she had already moved on. Grace felt it the moment they stood up. The shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The table that once felt like a courtroom, where she sat on trial under amused glances and sharpened words, now felt impossibly small, as though the space itself had outgrown the people still seated there. Juncio offered his arm. Not as a display. As a promise. Grace slipped her hand through his, the gesture natural, unforced. She didn't look back immediately. She didn't need to. She could feel Ethan's eyes on her, heavy now, no longer assessing, but searching, looking for something he could still claim. There was nothing left for him to find. They took 2 steps before Ethan spoke again. Grace. Her name stopped her, not because it carried authority, but because it carried history. She turned slowly. Yes. Ethan stood now, one hand braced against the table like he needed support. You really don't have anything else to say? The question was almost desperate. Grace studied him for a moment. This man had once been the center of her world. She had planned a future around his ambitions, bent herself into his expectations, and convinced herself that love meant endurance. Now, she saw him clearly, and clarity changed everything. I've said everything I needed to, she replied gently. Lucy let out a brittle laugh. Wow, she said, shaking her head. This is dramatic. Grace shifted her gaze to Lucy for the first time in a long while. You mistook my silence for weakness, Grace said calmly. That's not drama. That's misunderstanding. Lucy opened her mouth, then closed it. The manager appeared again, nearly tripping over himself in his hurry. Mr. Kong, he said nervously, your table is fully prepared. The chef has sent compliments. Jun Seo inclined his head. Thank you. The manager hesitated, glancing awkwardly at Ethan. And sir, he added, turning to Grace, everything tonight will of course be covered. Lucy's breath caught. Covered, she repeated. Yes, ma'am, the manager said. All of Mrs. Kang's guests this evening are fully accommodated.
Guests.
Grace had not been the guest at this table. She had been the reason for it. Ethan's face strained slowly. You're paying for this? He asked Jun Seo. Jun Seo looked genuinely confused. Of course, he said. Why wouldn't I? Lucy stared at her untouched plate, cheeks burning. That's unnecessary, she muttered. Grace smiled faintly. It really isn't. Jun Seo guided Grace forward again, but this time, she paused on her own. She turned back once more, not to reopen wounds, but to close them properly. I want to be clear, she said, voice calm, measured, unwavering. I didn't come here to prove anything. She looked at Ethan. I came because I thought you might finally see me differently. She glanced at Lucy. But I realize now you never really looked in the first place. The words weren't cruel. They were final. Jun Seo led her toward the private dining room, their footsteps echoing softly against polished floors. The deeper they moved into the restaurant, the quieter the world behind them became, until it faded entirely. Inside the private dining room, the air was warmer,
Softer.
intimate. Candles flickered against dark wood and glass walls. A separate world, designed for conversations that mattered. Jun Seo pulled out Grace's chair. She sat, exhaling slowly. Only then did the tension leave her shoulders. You are very composed, he said, pouring her water. I was terrified, Grace admitted quietly. He looked at her. But you didn't let it show. No, she said, because I've already survived the worst part. He smiled then, not proud, but deeply moved. That's exactly what they'll never understand. Outside the room, at the table left behind, Ethan sank back into his chair. Lucy slammed her napkin onto the table. How did this happen? She hissed. How did you not know any of this? Ethan didn't answer, because for the first time, the truth had found him with no mercy. He had assumed Grace would struggle. He had assumed she would need him. He had assumed wrong. The bill arrived, already stamped paid. Lucy stared at it, humiliation crawling up her spine. So what? She muttered. We were just props? Ethan stared straight ahead. No, he said quietly. We were the past. Back in the private dining room, Grace lifted her glass. To peace, she said softly. Jun Seo touched his glass to hers. To the woman you became. Grace smiled, not because she had won, but because she had finally let go. The private dining room felt like another world. The noise of the restaurant faded into nothing more than a distant hum, as though the walls themselves were protecting Grace from everything she had just endured. Candlelight glowed warmly against dark wood, casting soft shadows that danced gently with every small movement. For the first time that evening, Grace felt her body relax. She exhaled. It was the kind of breath that came from deep within, a release she hadn't realized she was holding on to until it finally escaped her. Jun Seo noticed. He always did. He poured her wine slowly, deliberately, the quiet ritual grounding them both.
He didn't rush to speak.
He didn't ask if she was okay in a way that demanded reassurance. Instead, he simply sat with her in the stillness, offering presence rather than questions. Grace wrapped her hands around the glass, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. I didn't think it would feel like this, she said softly. Like what? He asked. Like relief, she replied. I thought I'd feel victorious. Or angry. Or even satisfied. She looked down at the flickering candle. But I just feel light. Jun Seo smiled gently. That's freedom, he said. Grace leaned back in her chair, eyes tracing the ceiling as memories rose uninvited. There was a time, she began slowly, when I thought surviving my marriage was my greatest achievement. Juncio listened without interruption. I measure my days by how little I needed, she continued. How quiet I could be. How agreeable. I thought love meant endurance. That if I stayed long enough, bent far enough, I'd be chosen. Her voice did not shake, but the weight of the words pressed heavy. I lost myself trying to be palatable. Juncio reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. You found yourself again, he said. Yes, Grace replied. But only after I walked away. She met his eyes then. And only after I met you. He didn't deflect the credit. He didn't claim it either. He simply said, we met each other at the right time. Grace smiled. You never tried to save me, she said. You never treated me like something broken. Juncio's thumb brushed lightly against her hand. Because you weren't. There it was. The truth she had needed for years, but only truly believed now. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. When Ethan spoke tonight, she admitted, there was a moment where I almost shrank again. Habit. Muscle memory. Juncio nodded. Old wounds remember what the mind is healed. She smiled softly at that. But then, she continued, I looked at you, and I remembered who I am now. He smiled. A woman who doesn't ask permission to exist. Grace laughed quietly. Yes, she said. Exactly that. They ate slowly, sharing small tastes, comfortable silences, laughter that came easily. This was not a performance. There was no audience to impress, no history to rewrite. Just two people choosing each other in the present. After a while, Grace leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. Do you ever think about how different my life could have been? She asked. Juncio considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, but not with regret. She tilted her head. Why not? Because if you hadn't lived through what you did, he said gently, you might not recognize peace when it found you. Grace let that sink in. You know, she said, smiling, when Ethan used to criticize me, he said I was too soft. Juncio raised an eyebrow. Softness is not weakness, he said. It's control. She laughed. He never understood that. Men who mistake dominance for strength rarely do. Grace reached for his hand again. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For choosing me, she said. Every day, without conditions. He lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You were never a consolation prize, he said. You were always the goal. Grace closed her eyes briefly, letting the words settle where old wounds once lived. Outside the private room, the city continued. Loud, restless, unaware. But inside, Grace felt anchored in a way she never had before. She wasn't proving anything. She wasn't defending herself. She was simply living. As they stood to leave, Juncio adjusted her coat gently over her shoulders. Grace caught her reflection in the mirror near the door. The woman looking back at her stood tall, not because she was protected, but because she trusted herself. The humiliation of the evening no longer had teeth. It had been transformed. Not into revenge. Into closure. Grace slipped her arm through Juncio's. And together, they stepped forward, not away from the past, but beyond it. The city breathed differently at night. Lights stretched across the skyline like constellations grounded in glass and steel, and the air carried the quiet hum of lives unfolding in every direction. Grace stood beside Juncio outside the restaurant, the cool night brushing gently against her skin. For a moment, she simply listened, to the distant traffic, to the soft click of heels passing by, to the rhythm of her own steady breathing. She felt calm. Not the fragile calm that could shatter with one wrong word, but the kind that lived deep in her bones, earned through loss, reflection, and growth. Juncio opened the car door for her, but Grace paused before stepping inside. She looked back once. Through the tall glass windows, she could still see the table they had left behind. Ethan sat slouched in his chair now, the confident posture he'd worn earlier completely dissolved. His shoulders were heavy, his hands clasped together, as if he were holding onto something that had already slipped through his fingers. Across from him, Lucy stared down at her phone, jaw tight, scrolling without seeing. They looked small. Not because Grace had risen above them financially or socially, but because they were still clinging to a version of the past that no longer existed. Grace felt no triumph in the sight, only understanding. She remembered who she had been when she first walked into that restaurant. Careful, composed, braced for impact. She remembered the quiet dread she'd carried in with her, the way humiliation had once felt inevitable. Now it felt irrelevant. Junseok watched her, reading the shift in her expression. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Grace nodded. "I am," she said. "I just needed to see it clearly one last time." He followed her gaze, then looked back at her. And I don't belong to that chapter anymore." A small smile curved his lips. "That's how you know it's finished." Grace slid into the car. As they drove away, the restaurant lights blurred into streaks of gold and white, fading behind them like a dream losing its hold upon waking. Inside the restaurant, the silence was unbearable. Lucy broke it first. "So," she said sharply, locking her phone, "you really had no idea?" Ethan didn't respond right away. He stared at the place where Grace had been sitting, at the untouched glass, the neatly folded napkin. Evidence of her presence. Proof that she hadn't imagined any of it. "I didn't think she could do better than me," he said finally. The words shocked even him. Lucy turned slowly. "What did you just say?" Ethan exhaled. I thought she'd struggle. That she'd need me. That I was the best she could get." Lucy's laugh was short and bitter. "Well," she said, standing, "that illusion didn't last long." She grabbed her purse. "You humiliated her tonight," she continued. "But somehow, you managed to humiliate me too." Ethan looked up. "This isn't my fault." Lucy paused. "No," she said quietly. "It's your pattern." She walked away, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Ethan sat alone. For the first time in a long time, there was no one left to blame but himself. The car glided through the city, smooth and quiet. Grace leaned her head against the window, watching reflections ripple across the glass. Her mind drifted, not backward, but inward. "You know," she said softly, "for a long time, I thought closure meant an apology." Junseok glanced at her. "And now?" "Now I know it means peace," she replied. "It means not needing them to understand." He reached over, lacing his fingers with hers. "Some people never see the full picture," he said. "That doesn't make your truth any less real." Grace squeezed his hand. "I'm glad I didn't cancel tonight," she admitted. "I needed to see how far I've come." Junseok smiled. "So did they," he said. Grace laughed quietly. Later that night, back in their apartment high above the city, Grace stepped out onto the balcony. The world stretched endlessly before her, vast, open, full of possibility. She thought about the woman she used to be, the woman who apologized too much, the woman who confused love with sacrifice, the woman who thought being chosen meant being tolerated. She whispered a quiet goodbye to her. Then she turned back inside. Junseok was waiting, leaning casually against the counter, watching her with that same steady admiration he always had. "Ready?" he asked. Grace smiled. "For what?" "For tomorrow." She walked into his arms, resting her head against his chest. "Yes," she said. "I am." They tried to humiliate her at a dinner table. They measured her by what they thought she had lost. But they never saw what she gained. Not wealth. Not status. Not even love. She gained herself. And when her Korean billionaire husband walked in, it wasn't to rescue her. It was to walk beside the woman she had already become.